Hi guys, so today I'm going to be comparing the second gen AirPod Pros to the Samsung Buds2 Pros, the Sony XM4s, and then the first gen AirPod Pros. But before we get into deeper comparisons, I just want to briefly talk about the sound signature of the second gen AirPod Pros. So right off the bat, I felt a great sense of space and openness in terms of soundstage from the second gen, and I could notice the improvement from the first gen. It just everything felt more open. Instruments and vocals had more room to, I guess, be placed around in the soundstage, and the overall presentation was very relaxed and very open. In terms of tuning, I would say the second gen AirPod Pros are very neutral and they're very balanced, leaning on the relaxed side. So, for example, the bass, although there is some sub bass rumble and the mid bass is, it's decent, but I wouldn't say it's bass head level or anything. I would say the bass is very safe, it's very balanced, and it's very palatable. So, anyone, regardless of whether you like bass or not, I think anyone can enjoy them to a certain degrees. Unless, of course, you're a bass head and you want that thump and impact, then definitely you're going to be looking at some other earphones, right? But in terms of bass, the speed, so the attack of the bass and then the decay of the bass is decent, is pretty good in terms of the overall truly wireless market. And I would say the detail in the bass is also good. It's nothing crazy. Like if any of you guys heard the Timeless or the the Z1R or some of the crazy IEM bass sets. Well, Timeless isn't crazy bass sets, but the speed in the Timeless is really good, right? So in terms of detail, it's not gonna be comparable to those, but I think it stacks up really good compared to the other three in terms of just detail and speed and separation. So there's never any bleed into the mids or there's no muddiness unlike the Sony's. Sony was a bit muddy and bloated in the bass, but in terms of the bass and the mids, there's no bleed into the mids. The mids was very clean, very balanced, and very accurate. So if you're looking for very clean mids, I think the AirPod Pro second gen does a very good job of that. And in terms of the treble, the I would say it's more elevated than the first one. So there is better treble extension on the second gen versus the first gen, but it's not gonna be anything crazy. Like it's not super airy, and it doesn't extend like the variations. If you guys know the variations, it's one of the better IEMs I heard in terms of treble. So it's not gonna be variations extended, but it's also not gonna be dark or quote unquote dark like the Mango T or like the original EJ07. So it's not gonna be that dark. It's like in between. So there's a good balance of detail and extension, as well as there's no sibilants or anything sharp and harsh in terms of the treble on the second gen. And in terms of technicalities like imaging and separation, I would say the AirPods second gen does a pretty good job of that. It's not gonna be like if you compare to IEMs, it's not gonna compare to like even $100 IEMs like the Olina. I would still say the Olina has better imaging and separation, but out of these three, I would say it probably does imaging and separation the best. So overall, in general, the sound signature of the AirPods 2 is just it's a relaxed listening. You're not gonna experience any harshness or sharpness from vocals or like cymbal strikes. The kick drums isn't gonna be super impactful, but it's also not light, so it's like a good balance between the both ends of the extremes. So it's very balanced in terms of the sound, and it's very inoffensive. So I feel like majority of people who don't know what they want, they're going to like the second gen AirPod Pros sound very much. And just in general, I just really like the soundstage of the second gen. Again, it's not the widest and it's not very 3D. So what I mean by 3D is that, for example, if this is me. I am sitting here in like a concert. A 2D presentation of Soundstage would be just simply a wall of sound in front of me, and then coming at me in, I guess, almost a single direction. So it would just be like this, right? I would be over here, and it would just the sound would just be coming from here. Whereas 3D, a 3D soundstage, like again, I'm right here, and then it would be more of a circle. So sound is coming from every single direction, and it's just more immersive. So in terms of 3D, the AirPod Pro second gen isn't. I wouldn't say it's super 3D. It's not like the Olena. If you guys heard the Olena has pretty decent 3D capabilities. So the second gen AirPod Pros are not 3D like the Olena, but it does have the most quote unquote 3D out of all three of them. In terms of soundstage, personally, my personal preference is I believe the second gen AirPod Pros does soundstage the best. So it has very great depth. So again, that's like the 2D aspect of the sound of being away from you, but it also has very good width. So, oh, sorry, hit my camera. So it would like left and right. Left and right is also very expansive. For example, the Samsung here, it has very good depth. So again, the 2D soundstage is over here. It's decent depth, but the width is kind of small. So you're looking at like a cone shape going outwards on the Samsungs. And this results in things being a bit recessed, like the vocals and instruments being pushed back more. And in my opinion, it's not as immersive as the soundstage on the second gen AirPod Pros. And for the Sonys, it's pretty similar, but the Sonys do lack a bit of air and depth. So in terms of width, I would say they're about the same, but the second gen AirPod Pros does beat the Sonys in terms of just overall distance of sound. And then the first gen, I would say it's also similar to the Sonys, very similar to the Sonys. So again, good wideness and okay depth, but the second gen improves on the first gen, sorry, in terms of just overall depth. So if I were to rank it, the first one would be the second gen AirPod Pros, and then it would be a tie between the Sonys and the first gen, and then lastly it would be Samsung coming in last because it is a bit confined on the Buds 2 Pros, and it is more inside your head and not very expansive from side to side. In terms of low end and sub bass and mid bass, I would say the Galaxy Buds 2 Pros has the most bass. So in terms of volume, it just has the most bass, right? But in terms of separation and detail and speed, I would say it's a tie between the Samsung and the second gen AirPod Pros, and then it would be after them it would be the first gen AirPod Pros, and then the Sonys. So the issue I have with the Sonys is that even though it has a lot of bass, the bass is not as detailed and textured, and it's very soft. But that's not the only issue. It also bleeds into the mids, and it creates this bloatiness in the sound where you don't hear much detail, and then everything is just soft and lower resolution than all the other three here combined. So even though the Sony has a lot of bass, like the Samsung has a lot of bass, the tuning makes it that the bass is a bit overwhelms the other frequencies and bleeds into the mids a bit. So if you're looking for the most impactful bass, it would be the Samsung, but it is, again, the presentation on the Samsung is more pushed backwards, whereas the AirPods second gen is more balanced, right? So it's also going to have good depth, but it's also has width, and that allows the bass to be closer to you and be more engaging. So in terms of engagement, I would say it would be actually a tie between these. But in terms of like just pure amount of bass, the Samsung definitely does have a bit more sub bass and just mid bass and rumble and impact just in general in terms of low end. But I do still prefer the AirPods because they do it the best and the most natural. So now in terms of the mids, this is fairly simple for me. It's just the AirPods, just the second gen just wins hands down. It's not too far away. Again, going back to the 2D presentation, if I'm over here, it's not like too far away. It's like right here. It has good width, and then it allows instruments to play around in that environment, right? So there's good separation in the instruments, and then there's no bass bleeds unlike the Sony, so the bass never gets in the way of the other frequencies. And then versus the Samsung is a bit more recessed, so everything feels a bit more distant and disengaging. So even though the Samsung does sound sharper due to its higher or more treble extension, it does sound sharper, like notes sound sharper. The image in general, it feels like Samsung put like a filter over the sound and made it a bit sharper. So if you guys ever use Instagram, you won't use a filter, and then you can increase the detail, sharpen it. It's kind of like that. So it's a bit sharper. The sound is a bit sharper, but it feels unnaturally sharpened. And it's not as intimate and engaging as the mids on the second gen AirPod Pros. But in terms of like detail separation, these two are pretty close. They're pretty much the same. And then it would be the first gen AirPod Pros, and then lastly it would be the Sonys in terms of separation, because the bass bleeds into the mids, and that kind of muddies the other instruments. So for example, if we're using a river as an example, the AirPod Pros, it would be like clear water, right? Samsung and AirPods, clear water, and then the first gen would be, a little bit of dirt, debris, right? But on the Sonys, it would just be muddy. I don't know, like any nicer way to put it. It's just a bit muddy on the Sonys, but I do know they come with some EQ functions, so you can maybe just EQ down the mid bass and the sub bass on the app. Like it sounds better, but just in terms of comparison, I'm not going to EQ this because then I have to EQ all of them, right? So when it's stock, the Sonys definitely sound a bit muddy in the mids and not as clear as these two. So in terms of treble, I would say the Galaxy Buds2 Pro has the most extension, and it sounds more lively and exciting than the other three over here. Whereas the Sonys, they just lack treble extension. So the issue with the Sony is that it has too much bass on one side and not enough treble extension on the other side. So it gets double whammied, and that really lowers its resolution and just perception of clarity and detail in general. So the Sony's just lacking treble extension, and then the second gen AirPod Pros falls in between these two, so it's not as extended as the Buds2 Pros, but it's way more extended than the Sony. So there's a good, it's a good amount of treble detail. It's very clear, and it's never fatiguing and sibilant, which I found to be untrue for the Buds2 Pro. So sometimes if you increase the volume, a higher volume, so I listen at 85 decibels, and in certain songs, it just gets too sharp. The cymbal crashes are just a bit too sharp, and the female vocals are just a bit too sharp in terms of tonality. So my preference, the way I would rank it, is that I would take the treble on the secondary AirPod Pros, even though it's not as extended. It's more balanced, and it's not fatiguing. It's very relaxed, but it's also very clear, so you can still hear the details. You're not gonna hear the micro details. Like again, if you guys know the variations, it's not a variation extension, right? But it does treble very smoothly, very enjoyable treble, and for long listening sessions and loud volume listening, I would say the second gen AirPod Pro does that the best. And after that, I would probably pick the Samsung. It would be probably a tie between the Samsung and the first gen. So the first gen is not as well extended as the second gen, but it doesn't have the issues of sibilance and sharpness that the Samsung can sometimes have on certain songs, right? And then lastly, it would be the Sony's, because it just lacks air, it lacks treble extension. Female vocals don't sound, they sound not dark, but they don't sound correct. So, however, but like if you're looking for a very lively presentation, or if you listen to a lot of female vocals and you don't listen at super high volume, so like mid volume or something like that, then the Buds 2 Pros are probably your best bet because again they're more exciting. There's more treble volume in there, and there's just has a little bit better extension, making the female vocals sing higher, I guess, in a sense. Now, in terms of vocals, I definitely prefer the second gen AirPod Pros over all of them because an issue that comes up with the Buds 2 Pros is that it gets sharp at times because of the elevated treble. Female vocals are just a little bit sharp at times, and because there's this weird issue with the staging. So the staging is very, it's very pushed out, it's very distant, but the female vocals still sound sharp, even though it's very even though vocals are very pushed out away from you, they still sound sharp somehow. So it's like kind of like a worst of both worlds, right? Your vocals isn't intimate, but it's also sharp, even though it's not intimate. That's the issue I have with the Buds 2 Pros. Just in general, it sounds unnatural, unlike the AirPods Pro 2s. Oh my god, these names are so close. But yeah, it just sounds more natural on the second gen AirPod Pros, and then vocals on here sound decent, I would say, but again, it lacks the detail and clarity because again, due to the bloatiness from the bass and the dip in treble extension, the Sony just in general sound less clear and less high definition, or quote unquote high definition, right? In terms of vocals, I would definitely pick the second gen AirPod Pros over all three of them because again, it sounds the most natural and it has a good balance of detail, but also not being too sibilant and sharp and relaxing, just enjoyable for long listening sessions or louder volume jamming, right? And then after the second gen, it would probably be a tie between the first gen and the first gen AirPod Pros and the Buds 2 Pros, because even though the Buds 2 Pros the vocals are gonna sound more clear, it's also gonna be sharper. Again, some people might like the exciting and lively presentation of the Buds 2 Pros, but it can get sharp at times for sure. Whereas on the first gen, even though there's no sibilance or sharpness, right? It does lack a bit of clarity on the vocals compared to the second gen. So that's why I would say they would be like similar depending on your taste. And then lastly, the Sony's is just a worse version of the first gen AirPod Pros. It just lacks the clarity that comes, or that's due to its its tuning, the bass, too much bass, not enough treble extension. In terms of detail and clarity, the AirPods Pro 2s and the Buds 2 Pros are definitely a step up above the first gen AirPod Pros as well as the Sony's. So in terms of pure detail retrieval, I would give it over to the Samsung, but just slightly because it has higher or more treble extensions, so you can hear the highs better that you otherwise would have missed on the AirPods Pro 2s. And it also has more bass, so you can hear or you can feel more rumble, or you can feel the texture more. But in terms of overall clarity, both of these are pretty much the same. And then after them, it would be the first gen AirPod Pros, and then lastly would be the Sony's, because again, the Sony, the bass is a bit too much. It bleeds into the mids, and also the darker treble tuning makes everything just a lot softer and less perceived. In terms of overall separation, I would give it to the AirPod Pro 2s. Because due to its wider soundstage, it allows the instruments more room to breathe and separate from each other. So I can pick out the instruments slightly better versus the Samsung, which is also very good. It's good separation, right? But because the soundstage, the width is smaller, the instruments are closer together. So sometimes it makes it a bit harder to pick out. And then after the Samsung, I would give it to the first gen AirPod Pros, because even though it has good width, it just lacks the clarity and just the technicalities, detail retrieval from the second gen. And finally, the Sony's would be last because again, the muddiness from the bass bleeds into the mids, and overall it veils the instruments separation a bit, so it gets very difficult to pick out guitar strings, kick drums, especially on very busy tracks, like for example like rock tracks, right? So That's how I would rank it in terms of overall separation. In terms of imaging, I would say it's a tie between the AirPod Pro 2s and the Buds 2 Pros. And then after those two, it would be a tie between the Sonys and the first gen AirPods. So imaging is very precise and it's fairly accurate in terms of speed and overall presentation on both of these. But it's not gonna be 3D, so it's not gonna be coming from like every direction. Again, the 3D staging, these don't have 3D staging, so the imaging isn't going to be like super immersive, but it's still very accurate and it's very precise. In terms of the first gen, the Sony's, it's going to be less precise and it's going to be a bit softer than the second gen and the Samsungs. Overall, if you're looking for a balanced, relaxed, non-fatiguing sound signature, but you also want, detail, then I would go for the AirPod Pro 2s. It's just more refined in terms of overall balance and it sounds the most natural to me. Whereas the Samsung is going to sound more exciting, more lively, but the trade-off is that, the soundstage is going to be a bit smaller than the AirPod Pro 2s. It's going to feel less open as the AirPod Pro 2s. And vocals are going to be more pushed back, as well as instruments are going to be more pushed back, but also have a sharpness at the same time. And sometimes the Buds 2 Pro does over sharpen on certain songs, so it can feel very artificially sharpened, like you put an Instagram filter over your picture kind of thing. So in terms of overall naturalness and just balance, I would definitely take the AirPod Pro 2s over any of them here. And I would say just avoid the Sonys in general, unless you're okay with playing with the app and EQing it, then sure, fine. But it's just it's bloated. The bass bleeds into the mids, and it's just not as quote unquote high resolution or detailed and technical as the other two over here. For hip hop and EDM, I think again both of these will do them very good, but this is gonna be more relaxing and it's gonna be more open sounding, where this is gonna be more exciting and more sharp, aggressive in your face. So it depends what signature you want. You can either get the Samsung or the second gen, unless you can find the first gen at like a super discount price. Like I think this is what, 250 USD, right? So if you can find it for like $100, I would say yeah, you can go. I think it's probably worth it. But 150, more than that, it's not gonna be. Just save up and get the AirPod Pro 2s because it's just more refined version of the first gen. And in terms of noise cancellation, the AirPod Pro 2s and the Sony's does the best job in terms of just canceling out background noise, construction noise, stuff like that. And then it would be a tie between the Samsung and the first gen. I think the first gen is slightly better than the Samsung because of fit issues on the Buds 2 Pros. It doesn't insert as deep as the others, so that's why I would say the noise cancellation is a bit behind on the first gen. And in terms of the mic quality, the second gen is definitely the best, and then it would be like a three-way tie between these ones, with maybe the first gen being a little bit better than the Samsung and the Sony's. And in terms of transparency mode, again, the AirPod Pro 2s is gonna have the best transparency mode by far. Like it's probably like two steps ahead of the Samsung and the Sony's, and a step ahead of the original one, which is already a whole step ahead of the Samsung and the Sony's. So the overall package in terms of just transparency mode, mic wise, and then the noise cancellation, I would definitely take the AirPod Pro 2s, as well as the battery life is 30 hours and 6 hours each time, right? It's decently good. I never found myself listening to more than 6 hours at a given time, right? So I personally I think 6 hours is a good amount. Maybe some people need more, I don't know, but that's just for me. And in terms of overall sound, again, I like a more balanced sound signature, so I would take the AirPod Pro 2s, and also because it's more refined and sounds the most natural and the most open out of all three of them. But if you like exciting signature, then you get the Samsung, right? But the first gen and the Sony's, again, I would avoid them unless you can find them for like very cheap. That's the only time I would probably recommend it. But overall, I think the AirPod Pro 2s is currently the best truly wireless earphone you can get. Just the overall package. Maybe there are ones that sound better, but in terms of just everything, transparency mode, noise cancellation, battery life, convenience, mic, sound, I don't think this is gonna be very hard to beat. And I would definitely recommend people who have an iPhone to get this. And even Android users, even though it's not gonna be as convenient, it's still going to be like, I think the sound quality and the mic and the transparency mode alone is enough for Android users to give it a try at least. So yeah, that's all for today's comparison. I hope it helped you guys, and have a good day.